What happens when someone from the New York Times tries to cosplay as a Balkan expert with 2 days of reading Wikipedia articles and maybe 4 total sources from both sides? This heap of a garbage fire. Today, we're going to read this monstrosity parading as objective journalism and show you how the media machine actively works to distort narratives and, more importantly, why they're doing it. Folks, you're watching Mario's History Talks. I'm Mario, and let's get started. When it comes to Balkan historical and political topics, the New York Times, time and again, no pun, demonstrates a glaring bias and a pattern of inaccuracies that distort the complex realities of the region. Whether it's their coverage of the Yugoslav wars of the 90s, the Kosovo conflict, or the political dynamics within Macedonia, the Times consistently adopts a narrative that simplifies and really often misrepresents the intricate ethnic, political, and cultural tensions at play. And there are instances where it is just flat out factually incorrect. Like in 2015, when the presumably gold standard for English language journalism thought that, unironically, Macedonia was part of the Soviet Union. So, what kind of Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting are we about to encounter today? Well, let's just take a look. All right, folks, so we'll take a look at this article now. Who owns Alexander the Great? It's a diplomatic minefield written by Andrew Higgins, purported Balkan expert in all things Macedonia. So let's take a look. The center of Skopje, the capital of North Macedonia, a Balkan country born just 33 years ago as an independent state, is awash in history. The statue of Alexander the Great looms over the central square. One of his father, Philip II of Macedon, towers above a nearby piazza, atop an oversized pedestal. The city is also littered with tributes in bronze, stone, and plaster that generations of other heroes from what the country sees as its glorious and very long history. So folks, right offhand here, the issue I have with this, again, the framing used here, born just 33 years ago as an independent state, what the country sees as its glorious and very long history, the bias, the subtle assertion there is that because Macedonia is just 33 years old as an independent state, somehow its views on its history and its identity are also skewed and not quite fully developed yet. And again, this is problematic because there's countries that have very long histories that are quite new to the international scene. I mean, you look at Kosovo, for example. They only came as a country in 2008, and absolutely nobody disputes their claims over the Illyrian identity, over their claims of being autochthonous, of course. And again, just because they're that young does not exclude them from having an ancient past and a long history. But again, the language here does tend to isolate Macedonia as essentially being a younger state, therefore not having a fully defined history just yet. So it's there, bias is there, it's subtle, but it's there. The problem, though, is that most of the history on display is claimed by other countries. Present-day North Macedonia, birthed by the breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s, has no real connection to Alexander the Great, who lived 2,000 years ago down the road in what is now Greece. Pause. He points out here, in what is now Greece. How recent has it been Greece? Are you referring to, 1920, when it became Greek for the first time due to population exchanges and Orthodox Christians from Turkey being imported to dilute the population and create a Greek majority in the region? Or are you perhaps referring to 1913, when this was the first time under Greek political control in its entire history? So the little language of what is now Greece is completely missing any context. It's clear that it's not always been Greek, but how much of its history has it been Greek? I wonder why that's missing. The fact that Macedonia is divided, not mentioned. The fact that the borders, because of that division, are artificial and do not represent the ethnic and natural borders of the people. The fact that the same people are on both sides of the border. The region where Alexander the Great was from, it actually still has Macedonian people living there. You go to Pila, you go to Kostur, there's still Macedonians there, still speaking Macedonian. The father of the modern-day Macedonian language, Krstipetkov Misirkov, was born in Pila as well. So again, a lot of facts, a lot of omission of facts here. And then he says, and many of the other historical figures honored with statues are Bulgarian. We know who he's referring to. We'll get into that in just a minute here. But again, very sweeping assertion here. They say that they're just Bulgarian. You have to accept it as a consensus. So we'll get into that in just a minute here. But who are you talking about? Because are you talking about Nikola Karev? Are we talking about Dame Gruev? Or are we talking about Tsar Samuel? who are we talking about? With the blanket assertion that they are Bulgarian. Because we're talking about Koliopoulos, for example. He made it very clear in his interview to the Greek newspaper Acropolis that he's not Bulgarian, and nor is the committee. And he actually considered himself a descendant of Alexander the Great. So let's be specific with whom you're referring to as Bulgarian, but we'll find out in just a couple paragraphs here. So lots of errors by omission here, and a lot of bias, I should say, by omission. Slavica Babamova, the director of the National Archaeological Museum, has spent her career digging up and displaying ancient artifacts. Has no problems focusing on the past, but she said she was unsettled by the plethora of statues erected by her country in an effort to build a state and national identity. We have such a rich history of our own, and so many things to say, but I don't see any need to push all this overdone marketing, she said, gesturing toward the Alexander the Great statue during the interview. So folks, two things can be correct at the same time here, and this article completely misses that. Are there valid criticisms of Skopje 2014? Yes, and I'm part of the critics. Can it be argued that it was poorly thought out, not aesthetically pleasing, not constructed with quality materials, and not gone through more of a careful selection process? Absolutely. But at the same token, this is not because we're trying to build a state and national identity. Again, Macedonians have had a fascination, have had a connection with Alexander the Great and how they expressed their Macedonian patriotism, at least in the early 1800s. There's some sources that go back even to the 1700s. If you look at Baron de Tots' travels through Ottoman Turkey, he said he met Macedonians there that were still singing songs of Alexander the Great. But comfortably we can say from the early 1800s, the Macedonian identity in its first steps as a non-Greek identity, as part of that decolonization process, they still connected their origin, their identity to Alexander the Great. We see that with the Miladinov brothers. We see that with Kuzma Chepkarev. We see that with the Lozar Society. I mean, so many different organizations, folks, folklorists, poets, historians of the time period absolutely were expressing their Macedonianism through the lens of ancient Macedonia and the glory and honor of the ancient Macedonian kingdom. So this is not by any means building a state and national identity. If, again, she's part of the archaeological museum, but anybody with a basic understanding of history knows that the Macedonian identity was connected to Alexander the Great in the 1800s. And again, this is the exact same time period when all the Balkan states more or less were developing the narrative around their national identity. Macedonia had a slightly later start, but they all looked to the medieval and ancient empires to create a national narrative, a romanticized view of who or what they were, to attempt to establish continuity with those lands. So again, no context is brought up here that it has a much longer history than Skopje 2014, this connection to Alexander the Great. More important for North Macedonia, and it's really part of its history, she added, are the golden funeral mask and other stunning artifacts that predate Alexander and were found in an ancient necropolis near the village of Trebenice in North Macedonia. Fair, yes, this is true. But it also is true that the country who possesses these artifacts is not named. And she doesn't actually, I mean, there's a link here, obviously, but that paragraph itself doesn't talk about why this is an issue. It's an issue because Bulgarian soldiers in World War II essentially looted artifacts native to Macedonia and brought them over to Bulgaria. And of course, the whole world is up in arms and crying over Greece and the Elgin marbles, how they should be returned to Athens. And I'll agree with that, that's fine, but nobody bats an eye when Macedonians have had their archaeological artifacts looted by another country and are not housed in the country where they came from. So just reeks of hypocrisy and a double standard there. Not even mentioning Bulgaria, because this whole article, it's going to tee up Macedonia as the villain here, and again, Bulgaria as being a victim of Macedonia's views on their history. We'll get into that in just a minute here. All right, and here we have this lovely number here. A Macedonian woman selling trinkets and other images associated with Alexander the Great with quite literally a snake wrapped around her neck. Are you kidding me? Like, folks, do we for 1 second think there's no double meaning to this juxtaposition of this image? You know, nothing to do with people being afraid of snakes or biblically, theologically being associated with lying, falsehoods, duplicity, none of that. The fact that this Macedonian woman that sells images associated with Alexander the Great, who's got a snake wrapped around her neck, has no indication of bias or any kind of messaging or overtones. Nothing to connect the pieces with there. I go to Macedonia all the time. I see people with snakes around their necks all the time there, like you wouldn't believe. How this is even being treated as objective journalism is beyond me. It's subtle, but the cues are there. In totality, you're going to walk away with some pretty negative feelings, pretty negative sentiments about Macedonia after reading this article. That's all I'll say there. So, North Macedonia's identity building has long infuriated Greece, which claims ancient Macedonia as a part of its own heritage and has a region named after it. Ooh, that is, oh my goodness, I didn't know that part. So, folks, let's play a little game. We'll call it historical time travel. We'll just mentally try to go through some different dates here. So, it's infuriated Greece because it claims ancient Macedonia as part of its own heritage. So, let's go back to the 80s when the entire political and administrative unit that was then called Northern Greece was officially called Macedonia, when the airport of Northern Greece was also renamed to Macedonia. And of course, Greeks will say, oh, but look at this postcard from 1905. It was called Macedonia. Look at this stamp that I have here. It was called Macedonia. Clearly not understanding how a standard bell curve works. They're only finding the evidence at the extreme outliers, completely ignoring that the vast bevy of evidence from the time period shows that the common nomenclature around this region was Northern Greece. It was not called Macedonia. And if we go back a little bit further, the 70s, Alexander the Great pops up in Thessaloniki. The statue that we know of Alexander the Great today only showed up, I believe, in 1977. No use of the Virginia sun, no statues of Alexander the Great were popping up, only happened in the 70s. I wonder why so late to the game there. And if we go back even further, we can go back to the 20s when, again, this supposedly Greek heritage of Macedonia, when the Greek government had to import Turkish refugees, Orthodox Christians, to dilute the population and create a Greek majority there. We can also bring that up. But we can also bring up the 1800s as well, when Greece actually, of the time period, thought that Slavic-speaking Macedonians were the actual descendants of the ancient Macedonians, but somehow had forgotten their Greekness and their Greek language, so it was up to the Greek state to embrace them and make them Greek, essentially. We can talk about that as well. Or we can talk about how, in the grand scheme of things, when Greece was first becoming a state and first creating its ideology in the early 1800s, it didn't give a crap about ancient Macedonia, nor did they associate the heritage of Alexander the Great and the ancient Macedonians as a part of its heritage, like this article seems to be claiming. Let's take a look at some sources here that I have printed off that I'll be linking down below. It just talks a little bit more about how in the formative years of the Hellenic Republic, the view of ancient Macedonia compared to today was essentially night and day. Completely different. So first we'll be reading from The Making of Modern Greece by Roderick Beaton and David Ricks. This is page 182. This is talking about the chief Greek cultural publicist from the period leading up to the War of Independence, Adamantios Korais. Korais saw the period of Turkish rule as simply the lowest point of the downward path that the nation had followed ever since Greece had been conquered by the Macedonian king Philip II in the second half of the 4th century. So, when the chief cultural publicist of Greece, in the period leading up to the War of Independence, said the Macedonian period was part of the low point of the Greek history. That's from the 1800s as well. Then from the book Language and Identity in Greece, this is by Peter Mackridge on page 47, talks about how 1796, the doctor and poet Yorgos Sakalarios laments the passing of the ancient Greek city-states and the tyranny of the Macedonian kings, which was followed by the Roman yoke. And you'll see this, folks, this is pretty consistent. Greeks of the time period thought that the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, and the Macedonian kingdom were all enslavers and subjugators of Greece. And again, this is from the 1796 era. So very early on, this was still lamented as a down point for the Greek history. And finally, folks, we have actually a couple more. We have Nationalism and Globalization and Orthodoxy. This is from Victor ROUDOMETOF, page 102. Talks about, again, the 1821, the revival, I should say the creation of the Greek state. And the time period, he's talking about the fusing of ancient Greece with the Byzantine Orthodox tradition. He says, characteristic of this assumption was the intellectual's viewpoint vis-a-vis the place of ancient Macedonians in Greek history. During the 1794-1841 period, at least 14 intellectuals, among whom were prominent figures such as Panayotis Kordikas, Adamantios Koraios, Alexandros Soutsos, Yorgos Kozakis Tipaldos, and Yakovos Rizos Neroulos, expressed the opinion that the ancient Macedonians were not part of the ancient Greek world. The Macedonians were considered conquerors of ancient Greece, the first of a series of invaders that kept the region under rule for more than 2 millennia. 14 scholars of the time period thought that Macedonians had subjugated the Greeks. And then finally, folks, we have the political uses of the past. This is edited by Jacques Ravel and Giovanni Levi. This is page 30. Greek historiography is a product of the Greek national state. During the foundation of the new state, the constitutive myth was the resurrection of the mythical phoenix. Its significance was that Greece had been resurrected after having been successfully subjugated by the Macedonians, the Romans, the Byzantines, and the Turks. The first rector of the University of Athens, Constantine Skinos, referred to the metaphor of an enslaved Greece handed over by the Macedonians to the Romans and then by the Byzantines to the Turks. This was the first official view of Greek history in the aftermath of the War of Liberation in 1821. So folks, right after Greece became a state, they still were viewing Macedonian era as subjugation. But if you go back to Professor Higgins' article here, it says that it claims ancient Macedonia as part of its own heritage, and this has long infuriated Greece. So folks, I don't know how to put this together because it sounds like Greece incorporated the heritage of ancient Macedonia much later in its state history, and only really more or less started caring about it when they set their eyes on Macedonia and first tried to incorporate the Slavic Macedonians as the ancient Macedonians' descendants. And when that failed, just forcibly assimilated them, expelled them from the region, and tried to keep the word Macedonia and the whole idea of Macedonia pretty under the radar. While it might have been used occasionally, really it was only brought to the forefront in the late 70s and 80s when the idea of independent Macedonia was more or less becoming an option on the table. And folks, even during this time period, even in the 70s, amidst this start of the Macedonia fever, Greece had no problem identifying its northern neighbor as Macedonia. Geography textbooks and other maps attest to this. Greece had no problem with Macedonia calling itself Macedonia in the late 70s. So a lot of miscontext here. And he says, also in Greece, Bulgaria, another neighbor very possessive about some of its historical figures, particularly a 10th century Bulgarian ruler whose statues now crowd the center of Skopje. And again, folks, this is such sloppy research here. I mean, obviously he's talking about Tsar Samuel, but the fact he just calls him Bulgarian ruler without any additions, any additional context, just screams novice, just screams, hey, I'm going to Quora to do my research here. And as we all know, Quora is now garbage heap as well. But my problem with this is, first of all, medieval identities, especially those of rulers, of autocrats, are not signifiers of ethnic nor national identities. And if there was any sense of identity of the time period, it does not correlate with modern day national identities that are really a product of the post-French Revolution world. And especially with someone like Tsar Samuel, Paul Stevenson, who I'm reading now, he makes it very clear that the use of the word Bulgarian during this time period was of primarily a political nature, not a national one. Analogous to how somebody would call themselves the autocrat of the Romans. Same thing calling yourself the autocrat of the Bulgars. So why is the Roman identity so political and civic, but the use of the word Bulgarian in the Bulgarian Empire always refers to a distinct Bulgarian people and a Bulgarian national identity? That's one of the problems that, again, the study of the past reveals that it's not a continuation of identities from, much less from antiquity, but definitely from the medieval ages up until now. And even then, folks were using these political labels that completely contradicted their own ethnic origins. I mean, the whole Macedonian dynasty had Armenian origins, and they call themselves Macedonians. We have the, Tsar Samuel. He probably also had some Armenian origin vis-a-vis his mother. But the fact is they call themselves Bulgarians or Romans because that was the political way towards legitimacy. So such a sweeping assertion here that this was a 10th century Bulgarian ruler, and that use of the word Bulgarian is exactly how the modern day people of Bulgaria are using it. Again, just screams infancy in your understanding of history. I mean, it is just such a problematic statement to make. And again, I'm not going to be someone that says there was a Macedonian identity in the Middle Ages. I'm not going to say that because it's historically on weak grounds to say that. So very problematic, just in that one paragraph, so many glaring flaws. And he says, quarrels over who owns the past have not only unsettled scholars, but also had serious consequences, blocking North Macedonia's entry into the European Union. They also have clouded an ambitious nation-building project founded on history that others insist belongs to them, particularly Alexander the Great. Again, folks, I don't mean to belabor the point here, but the only flaw for Macedonia, unfortunately, the only sin, is it became a state after all the other nations had more or less developed their national histories, all of which intersected around Macedonia. Greece would lay claim to the ancient and part of the Byzantine heritage. Bulgaria will lay claim to the post-Byzantine up until the Ottoman period. And even Serbia throws in their part of the medieval period through Tsar Dusan. But again, Macedonia was simply a late arrival to the scene, and our neighboring countries have more or less set the stage, the tone, and the narrative around who and what represents their historical identities. And again, most of the world will accept it at face value because Macedonia is really not researched as much given all the controversies and all the quarrels that is engaged in. There's not a whole lot of new research happening in the region, unfortunately. And yeah, when it comes to who owns what, again, I'm not going to say there's a monopoly over who owns a historical figure. It's a shared history for sure, but this idea that Greece has direct claim to Alexander the Great, also on shaky grounds, because again, this is something that's not mentioned here. There is a very, very messy genetic, cultural, and demographic history in the Balkans here that really excludes anybody from having direct linkage, direct continuity to antiquity. So just a little addition there that would have made a big difference, but completely lost over. And here's where we get to the meat and potatoes of this article. A conquering hero's empire stretched from the Balkans to India. In the 4th century BC, Alexander was born in a city now in Greece. Again, now in Greece. Since when has it been in Greece? And more specifically, how long has it been Greek? How long has the population there been Greek? A little history question for you there. He did not live in the territory of what is today North Macedonia, which again, not true, because modern day Macedonia also has a territory that was once part of the ancient kingdom of Macedonia. The tribes that constituted Upper Macedonia were incorporated into the Macedonian state by King Philip. And again, most historians agree that these were akin to the Macedonians, a very similar founding stock, similar cultures that, again, for political reasons were distinct from the Macedonians, but did eventually become incorporated into the territory of King Philip II and Lower Macedonia. So again, this whole territory question is just, it's absurd because it's a political demarcation, not an ethnic one, not a cultural one. It's just such a weak argument to make. And he did not live in the territory of what is today North Macedonia. Historians generally agree. Which ones? Because again, Macedonia does have a connection to the territory of ancient Macedonia, or speak its Slavic language. Slavs arrived in the area hundreds of years later. Oh my God! What a truth bomb! I had no idea. Slavs arrived hundreds of years later. The ancient Macedonians didn't speak Slavic. Guys, I can't even stabilize from the truth bomb that was just handed to me right now. This was just the missing piece for me. My whole life I've been wrong because I did not know that Slavs arrived in the area hundreds of years later and that ancient Macedonians did not speak Slavic. But thankfully, I live in the era where I have access to Professor Higgins, who reminds me of the fact that, yes, the Slavs came to the region hundreds of years later. Okay, folks, I don't mean to bring up the whole Slavic migration theory again and the components to that, but the problem here is, again, he assumes a more or less fixed, almost primordial view of identity, meaning that language and cultural continuity has to be unbroken to have any semblance of lineage or continuity. Again, completely missing the fact that there are demographic and cultural processes that can uproot and change an entire region, but not necessarily change the makeup of the people that constitute it. So, for example, we've talked about this before, but the French people, a lot of folks in Western Europe speak a Latin-based language today, even though historically their ancestors might have spoken Celtic languages, Germanic languages, a bevy of other languages as well. This does not exclude them from having a connection to those people. The Arabs of Egypt today, who speak Arabic, does not exclude them from the pyramid builders that spoke a Semitic language. And even we can look at the Palestinians, who genetic research has shown are actually descendants of largely the original Canaanites and actually Hebrews of the region from the time period, who now identify as Arabs and who speak an Arabic language. They are still connected to the people that lived there a long time ago, even though they have a different political orientation and identity now and different language. This has not changed the facts. But apparently for the Slavic migration, all that can be thrown out the window. Because there was a migration here, there's a complete severing between the ancient period, the medieval period, and the modern period because of this Slavic migration. Nowhere else in the world has a migration of this scale been used so politically to bifurcate an entire understanding of history. But because Macedonians today speak Slavic and ancient Macedonians did not, this is used as evidence to show why modern Macedonians cannot have a connection to the ancient past. Even though, like I said, the whole territory of what constitutes Macedonia, the core of Macedonia, has the same people living there today as the people across the border in Macedonia. Same language, same cultures, same traditions. So, if there are any so-called descendants of the ancient Macedonians today, who would they be? Would they be the people that have lived in the area of Macedonia, who mixed with the natives there, and who've been there at least since the Middle Ages, but again, as a result of the mixing and the demographic processes there, have roots from antiquity? Or are they going to be the people from Asia Minor that were imported to Macedonia in the 20s and largely didn't even speak Greek upon their arrival, but were actually taught Greek as part of the educational system? Who's going to have more of a claim to ancient Macedonia and the Macedonians, folks? Really ask yourself why that little, again, factoid was not brought up here. Screams a little, I don't know, biased perhaps? You tell me. But again, some saving grace here. Some of the territory of North Macedonia, some of North Macedonia's territory was actually part of the ancient kingdom of Macedonia and is scattered with archaeological sites containing artifacts from the time period. So this is, again, a third of the way down. This is the first time this is brought up after time and again showing how modern day Macedonia is not where Alexander the Great was from. I mean, that is really from the beginning here. So first of all, it shows that they have no real connection to Alexander the Great. And then shows here, let's see, where was it? Was born in what is now Greece. He did not live in the territory of North Macedonia, as if that matters. And but finally, we go a third of the way down. They concede that yes, there was actually connection to ancient Macedonia through the territory, but also archaeological artifacts as well. Crazy they didn't actually bring that up a little bit earlier in the article, but hey, at least they brought it up now. The problem, said Ms. Babamova, the museum director, is not that North Macedonia has no connection to the time of Alexander the Great, but that has overstated its claims. That said, she added, started after the disintegration of Yugoslavia, as nationalists began looking for ways to strengthen their fragile new state. Which, again, folks, this is just, it's factually incorrect, because the connection with Alexander the Great and ancient Macedonia is a product of the 1800s. Nothing to do with the breakup of Yugoslavia and the need for an identity. If anything, it was a reaffirmation of the original vision of the Macedonian identity from the early 1800s, when, again, all the intellectuals, reformers, and enlighteners were more or less consistent in their view of ancient Macedonia being part of the cultural legacy and heritage of Macedonians. Simple as that. But again, we're going to blame it on Yugoslavia, and we're going to blame it on nationalists. And as I said before, a lot of the thinking of linking to ancient Macedonia was also an attempt to create more of a unifying bond between all the various ethnicities in Macedonia, like the Vlachs and the Albanians, all of whom also claim antiquity as part of their heritage. This is actually meant more of a nation-building project across the ethnic spectrum, but again, completely missing this article here. At the end of the 1990s, there was a kind of hysteria, she added. Yeah, of course there was. Greece, furious when its neighbor declared independence in 1991 using the name Macedonia, vowed to block its entry into NATO and the European Union. True. As part of the deal with Greece in 2018, it agreed to call itself North Macedonia, a name the Greek government accepted as sufficiently distant from the ancient kingdom of Macedonia and Alexander the Great. Could have added here that it was changed after a failed referendum and a government that did not use any of the legal means or constitutional means to change the name of the country, but again, just a minor detail there. Just as tempers calmed with Greece, Bulgaria raised its own historical complaints, with nationalists insisting that Macedonia was an artificial nation confected by communist anti-Nazi partisans. And what I love about this, the way they say communist anti-Nazi partisans, it almost makes it sound like that label is offensive to Bulgarians and how they view the past, that calling the partisans anti-Nazi and communist is offensive to them. I wonder why. Who proclaimed a state in 1944 and spoke a Bulgarian dialect. Bulgaria, an ally of Nazi Germany, bing, 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 during World War II, threw up roadblocks in the way of European Union membership. Again, this is all correct, but again, it could also be said that, it's clearly political maneuvering, but no one credible agrees with Bulgaria in their view of the past. I mean, linguists do not agree with them. Anthropologists, sociologists, even those that are decidedly anti-Macedonian in their views, will not say that Macedonians are a fake nation, an artificial political construct, nor their language is a made-up language that's not their actual spoken language from history. Nobody believes this. Even Bulgarian scholars back away from the idea that Macedonian identity is an artificial construct. I mean, we looked at Chvada Marinov's essay just a few weeks ago. It said the same thing. So, yes, it's a very much a political issue, but luckily, most of the world, the credible world, does not agree with Bulgaria and their view of history. But because of political power and weight, they're forced to play ball, essentially. So, we have the same problem with Bulgaria that Ukraine has with Russia. They say you don't exist, said Nikola Minov, a history professor at St. Cyril and Methodius University in Skopje. True. Ukraine has struggled to assert a separate identity against just the Russian Empire, but the land now called North Macedonia has had to deal with the Russian Empire, the Roman Empire, of which was part of for 5 centuries, the Ottoman Empire, which governed these parts until the early 20th century, and intermittent rule by other outside forces, including Serbs and Bulgarians. I mean, if there is any saving grace here, it's the fact that it's acknowledged that Macedonia had vastly different circumstances in how it forged its state and its identity than almost any other country that we can compare it to. And also, just between us, I like how Serbs and Bulgarians are both lumped together as outside forces. Just a nice little addition there. But we'll keep going. Searching for a historical anchor with which to secure a new country, his only previous experience as an independent state lasted just 10 days in 1903. The central government a decade ago poured millions of euros into a vast redevelopment project for Skopje. It filled the city center with statues and turned drab government and commercial buildings into colonnaded palaces resembling a kitschy Hollywood set for a movie about ancient times. Folks, I mean, I'm not going to argue against that, but it's also important to keep in mind that a lot of the intentions behind Skopje 2014 were actually to restore Skopje as it once looked before the 1963 earthquake. So a lot of the buildings actually were just resurrected from the original 1963 design. So again, did it go too far in some places? Yes, but a lot of it was supposed to be a restoration of old Skopje. The country's restive ethnic Albanian minority also plunged into history as they asserted their own separate identity, erecting a big statue in honor of Skenderbeg, an Albanian military commander who, in the 15th century, led a rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. I'm not going to get into that dispute there. They have every right to celebrate their history and their heritage as well. I'm not going to say otherwise. I miss old Skopje, said Miss Babamova, the museum director, waxing nostalgic for how her city looked before the invasion of statues and Greek-style columns. It has lost its soul. I mean, as somebody from Bitola, I will agree with that. But again, it's more to it than just it was just an artificial makeup all at once. There were other motives to it. And again, a lot of the things were restored. I mean, the old city buses were restored to how they once looked. The opera building was restored. Some of the boulevards that old Skopje had were restored. A lot of the old elements did come back in there. But again, we can talk about its criticisms all day. The columns are mostly hollow, and some of the ersatz ancient facades are already beginning to crumble. The prime minister who ordered the makeup, Nikola Gruevski, fled to Hungary in 2018 to escape a corruption conviction. So folks, I mean, I'm not going to say otherwise. Yes, maybe they could have used more quality material, but it's also important to remember that the previous administration had absolutely no effort in maintaining or cleaning or even working with the Skopje 2014 statues. They completely neglected them and essentially let them, fall to the wayside. And because it was such an unpopular project for their party and their supporters, they really didn't pay any attention to their upkeep and maintenance either. So not much you can do with the corruption in the Balkans. It's endemic to both sides. But his nationalism-tinged party has returned to power after winning a presidential and parliamentary election on May 8th. Ding, ding, ding. I wonder why this article was just posted in light of that fact. Almost coincidental, huh? Let's see. Its current leadership seems to have cooled its ardor for Alexander the Great, but sees no reason to remove his or other statues. This is not a fake history that were just manufactured, the party's deputy leader, Timcho Mucimuskis, insisted. There are historians who say that we have real connections to ancient Macedonia. And folks, this is probably going to be the one that's repeated the most. Who are those historians? Who are those academics that say you have connections to Macedonia? And I'll say, folks, there is still a lot of research to be done. We don't know a whole lot about the true nature of the Macedonic tribes and the people there. But the problem we really face is most of the time we just try to find one historian, one researcher to answer all the questions for us. And really the idea that modern day Macedonians have a connection to ancient Macedonia, you have to look at different genres, different subjects, different studies in field of history to make that determination. So for example, we have Florin Curta. His archaeological research and studies not only dispute larger elements of the Slavic migration, which this whole article hinges upon, but his research also shows a continuation of burial practices in Western Macedonia from antiquity to the medieval period, even after the arrival of the Slavs. Ernest Damianopoulos, in his book, Macedonians, Their Past and Present, he makes mention of the bird fishing, also called cormorant fishing, that was observed around Lake Doiran as far back as the 5th century by Herodotus, and is still being practiced in Macedonia around Lake Doiran to this day. And this is something that's not practiced anywhere else in the world besides Macedonia, the region of Macedonia, and Japan. But there was clearly a transmission of hunting and fishing techniques from antiquity to the present day there. And then again, he also made light of the fact that there's Homeric traditions that also survived in Macedonia, from the mythology around the three sisters of fate that weave everybody's destiny. Illiterate villagers in Macedonia somehow were talking about this, or the placing of coins on the grave sites for the deceased to have fare to be able to cross the river Styx into the underworld. Again, clear linkage to antiquity in the cultural practices of Macedonia. And just a reminder, we have a whole video of it as well. Check it out down below. But other folks as well, other researchers that will highlight the fact that there is more of a connection than we might think. Dr. Joanna Nichols, she is a professor emerita of Slavic languages and literature. She basically says that the Slavic migration while there was migration, was more of a linguistic spread than a demographic change as part of her research. Professor Timothy Gregory, in his book History of Byzantium, he says that there was more or less the same people inhabited the region of the Balkans before and after the Slavic migration. What changed, though, was the political and cultural views of themselves and how they now differentiate themselves from the Romans, whereas they didn't before. And finally, folks, we're going to get into this in a future episode as well, but genetic research also shows how modern-day Macedonians have majority non-Slavic ancestry. The other component, roughly 65 to 70%, depending on which research you look at, is Paleo-Balkan. Simple as that. Paleo-Balkan from the region of Macedonia. And again, if there were to be modern-day descendants of the ancient Macedonians, which again, nobody's claiming direct continuity, who would they be? Because again, if we're going to say that they're Greeks, the Greeks that were there before the arrival of the Pontic Greeks, they're the whole 10% of the population of Macedonia that was Greek before the population exchanges. If we make the claim they are the descendants of the ancient Macedonians, genetically speaking, they're almost identical to Slavic-speaking Macedonians. Like, they cluster very close together, almost as if they're more or less the same people, but separated by language. They're much closer to one another than they are to the refugees that came from Asia Minor. So again, I'm not an exclusivist. I'm not going to say we have a monopoly over this. I'm very happy to include Greek Macedonians that were native to the region, the whole 10% that was there. Because again, when I look at it historically and genetically, they are very, very similar to us, almost as if they were cut from the same cloth, but just separated by language over many, many years of history. So, is there one author or historian that's going to say unequivocally that we have a connection to ancient Macedonia and the way that the nationalists need in the modern day discourse? Probably not. Is there still more research, more room to be done on Macedonia, modern Macedonians, the ancient Macedonians? Yes. But is there other independent research out there that, when we look at it collectively, shows that a lot of the assumptions we have about our history, what happened in the Middle Ages, what is being observed in Macedonia, does show that we have more connection to the ancients than we might have thought? Yes. And that's exactly what this article will skip over when it says most historians agree on this. What are the ones that don't agree with that? Where's their voice in this article? Completely absent. So, determined to hang on to that connection, the new government has angered Greece by signaling it wants to drop north from the name of the country. At a swearing-in ceremony in May, the newly elected president referred to it as just Macedonia, prompting a walkout by the Greek ambassador. So again, I don't care about it that much because no country really uses its constitutional name. And again, I'm not a legal expert, but I mean, Greece is called Elliniki Demokratia. They're not going to call themselves that all the time. The politicians will call it Elas or Elada. Germany, I think that its official name is the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany. Are they going to use that all the time? No. United States, people call it America. The constitutional name is the United States of America. Many countries have a different constitutional name than the preferred regular nomenclature of everyday citizens, including politicians. To me, not much of a surprise there, but I'm not a legal expert, so we'll take back my commentary. Mr. Mutsinski, the new governing party's deputy leader, said the 2018 agreement with Greece, surrendering Macedonia as the country's name, would be honored as a political and legal reality, but added, do we like it? No. Amen. Nobody likes it. Dalibor Jovanovski, a prominent Skopje historian, said he did not like the name North Macedonia either, but saw it as the unfortunate price that had to be paid for entry into the European Union. Questionable. There's probably no chance we're ever to get into the European Union, so was that a price that we had to pay? Probably not. Again, more roadblocks and ever-changing goals. Probably political calculation aside, not the smartest decision long-term. Everyone always thinks that history only belongs to them, that there is no shared history, he said. But in this part of the world, everything is fluid, everything is mixed up. Yes, And why was this little sentence, this little paragraph not put in like halfway before, like in the middle somewhere? Why has all the ammo against Macedonia already been, more or less used? And anything that gives it a semblance of balance, or again being objective, buried at almost the end here. By which you've already seen Snake Lady, and you've already heard that modern Macedonia has no claim to ancient Macedonia. Absolutely incredible. All right, folks, we're almost done here. Some Skopje residents say they do not like the clutter of so many statues, but many take pride in what they see as tributes to a proud, long history. The Greeks claim him, said Efremov, strolling past Alexander the Great, but he was Alexander of Macedonia, not Alexander of Greece. Correct. And again, there's a political motivation why Greece calls him Omegas Alexandros and not Alexandros o Macedon, like the rest of the world calls him. It is trying to be masked, I would say, the association, because again, the rest of the world does call him Alexander of Macedonia. And the problem with Greece is, again, it's an exclusive game for them. Nobody has a monopoly on history. It's very clear we are all mixed. We're all part of it together as part of this shared Balkan history. But again, this article, it hints at it, but it does not explore that concept nearly far enough. Bisera Kostadinov-Stoichevska, a former minister of culture, said she had planned to clear the city of at least some of the statues by moving them into a park outside of town, but she gave up after her staff, instructed to look for new zoning violations, found that unfortunately everything was legal. Well, at least they did it legally. She said she was particularly eager to get rid of a big rendering of Tsar Samuel, a 10th century Bulgarian king. Again, everybody says he's Bulgarian, which again, sure, that's fine. It's like saying Roman emperor was Roman. Big whoop. There were Arabs that were Roman emperors. I don't have a problem with that. That's cool. You can label him Bulgarian, but at least add some context to not create this false equivalency that the Bulgarian kingdom was entirely a national identity, not also a political and civic endeavor as well. It's missing so much of that context here. And again, I don't even care about Tsar Samuel that much. I really don't. But at least in terms of being objective, we need to be thinking about what the medieval era represented and what it did not represent. So again, not going to dispute him being called Bulgarian king, but the idea that his Bulgarianness is the same as the Bulgarianness of Bulgaria today, absolutely absurd. The statue, which faces Alexander, is not only ugly and obstructs the view, she said, but also really annoys Bulgarians. Which, crazy to me that the statue in Macedonia only says Tsar Samuel. I know somebody spray painted on their king of Macedonia, but that's fine. But in Sofia, it literally says something like Tsar of Bulgaria or Emperor of the Bulgarians. Which again, more political in nature, but at least Macedonia is trying to just be more objective about it. They're not trying to label him as Macedonian. We're not saying that. We're saying he came from the region of Macedonia. Macedonians were in his army, still part of our heritage. We're not trying to lay exclusive claim to him, and nor are we trying to say he's Macedonian, but again, that's something that could also be added here, that most Macedonians that study the past, objectively, will not try to claim him as Macedonian like we are today. She is not a big fan of Alexander the Great either. I don't feel connected to him all. Not linguistically, not culturally, not emotionally. Fair. That's your right. That's okay. I personally think, parts of his legacy are also overblown a bit. Am I wanting to sever that connection altogether? Absolutely not. The reason I like to associate Macedonia with the ancient Macedonians is because our forefathers, our pioneers, the Enlighteners, thought that was an important part of their identity. And probably, folks, if they didn't really care about it, in kind of a counterfactual, probably we wouldn't care about it as much today either. We probably wouldn't have. Again, it wasn't the diaspora that did this to us. It wasn't Yugoslavia. It's embedded in our history. We've had an association with Alexander the Great and how we express our unique Macedonianness and our desire for autonomy and statehood, and our uniqueness was expressed through the lens of ancient Macedonia. Even the people who call themselves Bulgarians, even those Macedonian Bulgarians, still link themselves and their culture, their history, to ancient Macedonia and Alexander the Great. I mean, Brailsford, he saw that in the Ilinden fighters, that they were talking about Alexander the Great as their predecessor, as their hero. Everybody was talking about him. Viktor Grigorovich in the 1800s said everybody was calling their kids Alexander and singing songs about him. So again, you don't have to like him. You don't have to feel connected to him by these terms, but you can't say that it's a forced connection or something that was just forced down Macedonians' throats. Absolutely not. We carved up our national identity, our myth-making, if you will, in the same way that every other Balkan state did as well. The Greeks' connection to antiquity and the way they frame it, also on shaky grounds. Bulgarians, they do the same thing with the Bulgars, even though they try to play both sides. We are Bulgars, but we're not Bulgars. We'll celebrate them, but we're not the same people. Everybody does this. It's only Macedonians that somehow get excluded from this because of the political maneuvering that's involved and the stakes that are in play here. Is Macedonia going to go pro-West or is it going to go towards Russia? That's why this whole historical dispute is being looked at in the way it's being looked at. It's trying to be delegitimized, picked apart, deconstructed to make it seem like it's not quite natural. And if this silly dispute about history could be resolved, if the Macedonians could just move on, their lives would be better. So, and let's just see what Andrew Higgins, what his little bio here says. Is the East and Central Europe Bureau Chief for the Times based in Warsaw. Covers a region that stretches from the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania to Kosovo, Serbia, and other parts of the former Yugoslavia. Yeah, no wonder his research is so sloppy. That is a huge region. From the Baltics right down to Macedonia, that's a big region. So folks, again, were there elements of this article I liked? Yes. But the biggest problem is in its framing, its pace, when it chooses to relay certain facts, facts that it completely omits. And again, taking a step back, it does not even nearly touch upon the real issues that were at play here, which again, we'll talk about. But overall, from an objectivity standpoint, I'll probably give this article like a 5.5, maybe a 6. Again, some of the facts are correct. Some of the criticism is valid, but the balance there is just completely absent. No semblance of even slightly trying to counter Greece's and Bulgaria's claims in this dispute. Nobody's got a perfect history. Nobody has a undisputed continuous claim to antiquity, and the fact that these types of facts don't make it in this article shows me where this research was coming from. And really, folks, this distortion from the Times is not really just an error of omission, but it really is a deliberate crafting of stories to fit an agenda. This oftentimes ignores or minimizes facts that don't align with their ideological stances, as we've seen. This deliberate framing frequently is going to paint one side as more virtuous than the other and often demonizing the other, just like we saw. And this will often ignore historical or political context. Such bias doesn't just misinform the general public. It's actively trying to rewrite history to fit a preconceived worldview, undermining the very fabric of what is objective journalism. And, folks, put on the thinking hats here. The statutes have been up since 2014. The PRESPA agreement signed in 2019. It's now 2024. The world has heard about the dispute over ancient history ad nauseum. Everybody knows about it. So doesn't it just strike you as just a little remarkable that the New York Times published this very article demonizing Macedonian identity and nationalism just as the center-right Vamaro Dapamane returns to power? I mean, it's almost as if their whole editorial calendar is just somehow synchronized with the political tides. Purely coincidental timing, I'm sure. And if you're hearing that subtle voice in the background of this article saying, give up your backwards and imposed sense of self-identity if you want to be a good Western little statelet and join the European Union, you're not alone, because I hear it too. But what I didn't hear, of course, is any mention of how a supposedly good and Western-style democracy like Greece can continue to largely deny its ethnic Macedonian minority any rights. You know, the people that speak the same language as us and live in the area where Alexander the Great was actually from. And despite the fact that this has been reported by the State Department, the UN Human Rights Watch, Helsinki Monitor, Minority Rights Group, you name it. And how can we just sit there and continue to pretend this argument, if you can call it that, has anything to do with Alexander the Great is absolutely beyond me. Crazy to think that this Balkans expert somehow missed that, somehow escaped his purview. So folks, with that, another episode of Mario's History Talks is in the books. Admittedly, I'm probably going to take a little break after this just to kind of reorient some things and focus on some other aspects of my life. But it's been great to connect with you finally and have all this consistent content. But in the meantime, I will probably just be updating Mario's Minutes on Substack quite soon here when I'm not making videos. So definitely check us out on that. But in terms of other news, we're going to be doing a 5,000 subscriber live stream coming up here soon. And I'm coming up with ideas to really make it a special event for everybody. But in the meantime, folks, again, we'll continue to be in this fight together. You kind of see now how important it is for us to keep our guard up, to be on the lookout for biases, omission of facts, deliberate framing, reframing. It's so crucial in the narrative that's out there around Macedonia. But good news is, like I said, we're all in this together. So definitely message me if you have any kind of questions. Always have your back. But in the meantime, folks, бидете поздравени, продължувайте со борбата за нашата майка Македонија и ќе се видиме за скоро. Голем поздрав. Пријатно.